how do you measure, as an economist, how do you measure, there's certain parts of a free trade agreement that are where the benefit is security, which is not necessarily a measurable, right? You can't put a number on it. But look, there's plenty of wars in our past that have been triggered by trade disputes. So this is not an unusual thing. But good relations with a country on the economic front can provide important security agreements. So maybe the point is that a trade deficit might be worth it because of a security trade-off, right? How do you factor that into your thinking? Because you know that some of that is the motivation for some of the trade agreements that we do cut. Like, I take the Colombian Free Trade Agreement. I felt like that was one that we escalated and we accelerated as much of trying to make sure Colombia didn't slip, right? This was a democracy that was on the move, coming towards us, if you will, right, away from its drug past and things like that. So we were really trying to help them. How do you factor that into your equations of trying to come up with fair trade practices?
It's a great question, but it's funny because I thought you were going to go in the exactly opposite direction, which is that a lot of the value of security for the United States is something that we don't take into account when we're doing our economic analyses, right? That in trying to value all the benefits of the cheap stuff, the costs of no longer being able to make essential goods, no longer being able to
the pandemic was an eye-opener. Look, the pandemic, I think, opened some people's eyes. Where China could have, if they really wanted to make us suffer, they could have, right? And they chose not to because they were suffering. They had their own issues.
Well, so there's the sort of resilience point for all sorts of goods. And then there's specifically what you do to the defense industrial base. We're seeing in the Ukraine context, our ability to even manufacture the kinds of weapons, you need to help support another country in a, limited land war elsewhere. You look at the sort of modeling of how long could the US actually sustain a conflict in the Taiwan Straits, for instance. What you see is, and you look at our ability to build ships or maintain submarines, or we've hollowed all that out. And none of that gets measured in the economic analyses of free trade either. So that being said, the point you make is also a good one, which is that there's real upside benefit to these kinds of trade agreements. And, I think the two things I would say about it, one is, I think that's a perfectly reasonable case, but it's one that we should acknowledge and break out in the analysis. That too much of the discussion in recent decades has just been, look, this is a win-win-win. Like, it advances this foreign policy objective that we have, but also it's really great for American workers. And if that's not actually true, then don't sell it that way. If you have we don't say we're going to go to war in this place, but that's okay. It's really great for the soldiers too. There's a baseline level of honesty that is necessary, among other things, if you want to sustain political support for making those kinds of trade-offs. So if we want to say, look, we're actually going to use our economic policy, our trade policy to support developing countries, that, we think that really makes a difference for Colombia, that makes a difference from, some other country in our hemisphere, that has real benefits for us. Great. But make the case on those terms. And then notice that case doesn't hold up when you're looking at those situations where trade is actually causing us problems, which is with those other major countries, right? It's not our trading relationship with Colombia, again, putting aside if they become a way for other countries to cheat, that is causing the distress. And on the flip side, you can't say, I don't think, well, look, obviously we have to treat Japan this way because, otherwise, I'm not sure what the otherwise is. I think the reality is that
we certainly we want Japan in our sphere of influence and not China's. We want the
but
EU in our sphere of influence and not China's.
You know who else wants Japan in our sphere of influence and not China's? Japan. Japan.
I agree. I think they do.
But
unless we make it really hard for them. I mean, eventually money, whether we like it or not, it's amazing how how the pocketbook will change a voter's mind. Just look north of the border, right? In a 90-day period, we saw what happened north of the border. So I don't know if anything should be seen as permanent when it comes to some of these relationships that we have.
Well, I certainly agree that the relationships aren't permanent, but I think that you can step back and assess the actual
Mhm.
calculations that other countries are facing. And, I think the United States should treat allies fairly and transparently and so forth.
Shouldn't
And
they get a better deal in your mind? Should our allies get a better deal than those that are either unaligned or adversarial?
oh, absolutely. That's
Mm.
that's a core um premise of I think the direction we're headed. And it's
Right.
important
Well,
to
that was, I think, the frustration at first, is that is not how the policy was initially rolled out, which I think is why so many of our closest trade partners freaked out.
I think that's a fair point about the freak out. I think it's
Mhm.
important to say that in terms of where I think the administration is trying to go, and again, I think another fair criticism is they haven't been clear enough in conveying where they're trying to go.
Mhm.
But piecing together those comments they do make and the actions that they've taken, it seems to me that the direction that they want to head is one in which there's a much better deal for countries that are sort of in the US sphere, as opposed to those that are not. The difference from the past, where I think we're really departing, is that in the past, especially post Cold War,
Yeah.
we didn't really ask much of anything because we were presiding over this liberal world order. Everybody got the full deal, right? China got open access to our market just as much as Japan did. And what what we are starting to shift towards a world where we say, actually,
Yeah.
the US has some things that it wants too. And those have to be fair and reasonable things. But I think the things that the Trump administration is gesturing toward are
Mhm.
fair and reasonable. So take the balanced trade point.
Yeah.
That seems pretty fair. The US isn't saying we demand that we now reverse things and we get to build up our industry at your expense. They're saying,
Mhm.
let's have a trading relationship that isn't beggar thy neighbor. Let's have one where everybody can have a healthy
Mhm.
manufacturing sector and trade stuff for stuff. And we will hold ourselves to that too.
Do you accept the premise that the more trade there is across borders, the less chance of war?
Not necessarily. I think there are certainly situations where that can be a healthy thing. But
Because
I don't
that's the essential argument critics of this are making, that, hey, look at the post World War II, right, to now. Yes, there's certainly been pockets we've had a war here, war there, but we haven't had a global war, right? Um, can you credit more open and freer trade with that?
I don't think so. I mean, most of that period you're referring to was the Cold War,
Mhm.
where we didn't have open and free trade, obviously. We had two competing blocks. And there was a totally different set of security factors in particular that sort of maintained that balance. Then we moved on to the post-Cold War period where, I appreciate your sort of casual description of a war here and a war there.
No, and I'm
Uh,
not trying to dismiss the smaller wars, but we haven't had a world war.
Well,
That's an important.
it's hard to think of what a world war even would look like in a context where the US was so much more dominant than
Mhm.
any other country. We had this period of hegemony,
Right.
and kind of the unipolar era was a very strange moment. And it's one that's we are moving on from as China rises into being a peer competitor. Now, I don't think that guarantees we have to have a war with China, right? We never really had
Mhm.
a war with the Soviet Union. But I think, again, as with the claim that, like, well, the economy is bigger, so it must be because globalization is good. I think the idea that, like, well, we haven't had a world war since the 1940s, it must be because globalization is good, is the sort of like comically oversimple analysis that the exact same people making it
You
would
must not be on
laugh
the
out of
internet.
the
You must not be in the internet. Comically overly simplified arguments are what make the
but
internet go,
but
Oren. You know
right,
that.
but this is my point, is that the sort of capital V very serious people who are making this argument because it happens to prop up this ideological
Right.
preference they had. If they had a different ideological preference, they would be laughing this argument out of the room too.